Okay, what I will try to present in this class is what these sayings, very famous sayings, the Megillah Esther is not Beteilim Lowy, that Purim is not Beteilim Lowy. What these things seem to mean when you actually find them in their original context. So I'm not sure if I said it or I will say it now. We need to remember that every Mama Chazal, really, every idea that we know that is part of our world of Torah, of ideas, generally, and this is a general truth. It's true in this particular case, but it's also very generally true. We generally know it in the way that it's come down to us, in the way it was framed in the Torah Rishonim, the Rambam, Tosfos, Rashi. These are the kinds of people that framed for us, even when we say Mamar Chazal, or things that are even earlier, maybe even Tanakh. Generally, the way in which it's framed, the way in which we know it, or we could say, which Mamar Chazal do we know, which are not known. If you read Medrash, there's thousands and thousands of Medrashim, even real Medrashim, there's no doubt their authenticity. Medrashim of Tanuim, and Medrashim on Chumash, Medrashim in general, Braises, Tesefta, and so on. Sefris, Medrash Halacha, Medrash Agoda. Generally, the ones that are known, the ones that are part of our Torah world, so to speak, in a live way. Of course, theoretically, everything is great and everything is heilig and everything. But the reality, the ones that we know are the ones. If, for example, in Chumash, Rashi brings a medrash, then this becomes sort of when people say, Chazal learned this parsha like this. Usually they mean the Chazals that Rashi brought, or sometimes that Ramban brought, other Rishonim that get read a lot. And although there's hundreds of more Mamar Chazal that are out there that might even say other things, very often if you actually research things, you start seeing that other ways of thinking, and even ways that we generally say, very often there's this story told, like there's Chazal Shita, and then there's some Rishonim al Pshat Shita, and then you actually open the Medrash and see that the Medrash actually gives both options, and at least it's very easy to read it as saying both options, and these are both Chazal, or there's even more Chazal that we don't understand what even they mean, and so on. So this is a very important point to remember, and not to denigrate either one of these methods, but it's important to realize that our Torah, even when we say Chazal, and especially when we say Chumash, but even when we say Chazal, generally we mean the Chazal as it was framed by the Rishonim, and Rishonim, sometimes even by Achronim, but even people that do learn Be'iyah generally take the Rishonim as their starting point. And Rishonim are not Pshat Chazal. We have to remember that they're not Pshat Chazal, and not, of course, they're not Pshat HaChumash, even when they're trying to do Pshat Shal Mikra, by the way. But they're not Pshat. They're not structured in the way Chazal structures it. Right? This is a very tricky thing to realize. Just the way you structure things, just the form that you think putting things in. I always use the idea of Tariq Mitzvahs, that the Rambam and other Rishonim saw as the basic framework for Torah. And that's not a framework that we find in Chazal. We do find the Stay Memra, the Starek Mitzvahs in the Torah, that's basically an Aguda, that's trying to say something entirely different than what they use it for. And they're using it and they're framing everything in an entirely new frame. So, okay, anyways, this is a general point, but it's also true for our statement. This Mamar, which is Purim, Lowy, Neftolim, is known to us from one and two sources from Rishonim. One of them is slightly earlier than Rishonim, but these two sources, I think I've said all of this in the previous class, which are Rabbi Elazar HaKaler's poem for Parshas Piyat, for Parshas Zachar, and the Rambam in the end of Hilchas Megillah. Now they say slightly different things, and we'll get to it, how exactly it's framed in these sources. But mostly, if you look in the Mefarshim, both of the Rabbi Elazar HaKaler's Piyat and in the Rambam, they both all quote two main sources in Chazal, in Medrash, for this idea. The first source, which is quoted in both the Mefarshim already in the Zman Rishonim and the Piyat of the Kali, and the Mefarshim Rishonim, the Maggid Mishnah and others, actually not the Maggid Mishnah, but other Mefarshim and the Rambam, they both quote this Yerushalmi. And then there's a second source, which is the Medrash Mishli, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, notwithstanding what the Rambam might want to do with this, there will be an extra class to try to figure out what the Rambam is doing it with this Mama, and we'll talk about what the Kali is doing with it if we'll get time. What the Yerushalmi, I'll speak about the Yerushalmi first. What the Yerushalmi is doing with it is very interesting, and when you open the Yerushalmi, you get a certain clarity and also certain questions. So let's open it up and we'll see. So the Yerushalmi is on the Mishnah. The Mishnah, in Masechtas Megillah, Mishnah Hai, first Perek, or Halacha Hai, it's called in the Yerushalmi, which is the Mishnah of Adar Shani. Koreas Megillah ba'Adarisha, when it's Abra Shana, Korenas ba'Adar Shani, and in Adarishan Adar Shani, Ella Mikra Megillah, and Matanas Levyanim. So this Mishnah is talking about the question of when there's two Adars, or maybe only when there's one Adar, and we after Purim we decided to make it a Ibayir, so there's now a second Adar. So do we have to redo the Megillah? Do we have to redo Purim or not? Okay. Now, this is of course very famous Mishnah. There's a Gemara in Bavli about it. Now, this question is, what is the reasoning behind this, right? What is the tam? Why should it be a chilek? Now, we know the Bavli says everyone knows, but the Yerushalmi understands on the Bavli actually, but the Bavli actually interprets it slightly differently. But there's a member of Reb Shimon ben Levi, Reb Shimon ben Levi, and this member it's in the Bavli also. I'm just gonna check if right, it's in the Bavli in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Over here it's Reb Shimon ben Levi. And he says that it's from the Pesach, Lekaim esigeres apirem hazois hashainis. He said, what's hashainis? So this is actually, if you learn the Pesach, you'll see it's not a simple word to interpret. If you read the story of Purim in the end of the Megillah, and you see it says 3 times that we decided to make Purim, and maybe this is very important to understand this whole discussion here, because really, like everything Chazal, it really goes back to Pshita Shel Mikra. It really goes back to where I have the Megillah itself. Now, so I will discuss this for a second. So in the Megillah Esther, and probably I think the most similar thing is in Parshas Bo to the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Megillah Esther is both a halacha book and a story book, just like the Chumash and Sefer Shemos especially. So there's the story of the Megillah, and then when we get to the end, some Perek tests more or less talks about how the Yiddim Asher B'Shishan had one day had Purim and Tezvov, the rest of the world had in Yudalid, and then it says Alka, and therefore the Yiddim Aprusim do Yudalid. It doesn't say what Tezvov does, but that's another whole question. And then it says Mordechai wrote a letter, Vayichtav Mordechai. So just like the whole Megillah is people writing letters. There were letters from Achashverosh to this, letters from Haman for that. Earlier there were letters from Mordechai to make that the Yidden could be Lekol V'Lam Danafsha. Now there's a second letter that Mordechai writes. And this is the letter of creating the Yom Tov Purim. So he writes it at Dvurim Ma'ila, L'Kayim Aleim, Lias Oisem, Meseiman Ba'osa, B'chol Shina V'Shuna, and so on. It says V'Kibul Ha'idem, they were makabel, the letter of Mordechai, they were makabel to make Yom Tov Purim every year. It says again, Kimi V'Kibul Ha'idem, so it's already a third time. It says they were makabel Shnayim Ma'ila, B'chol Shina V'Shuna, and then it says that actually it's done, V'Yim Ma'ila Neskerim V'Nasim, okay? So this is the first Pashta, is the first letter of Mordechai. That seems to make sense, more or less, the Seder HaDvarim. Then it says again, then there's a second letter. V'tichtav Estra Malka B'Savichai L'Mordechai Yides Kal Toikef L'Kayim Isigeres HaPurim Hazois Hashainis. And it doesn't really say what this letter is. It says Veishlach Svarim, L'Kayim Es Me'Purim Ha'el V'Zmanayim Kasha Kim L'Mordechai Yidev Estra Malka Kasha Kim Al Nafshim Hazaram It's not clear what is going on with this second letter, or why is it even a second letter. Maybe we should read it as being the same letter. It's Hashainis relative to the earlier letter that said that they could defend themselves against their enemies. Maybe that's the pshat, and this is really all the same letter. Why would there be 2 letters saying the same thing? So this is a very big question. And even, what is this word Hashainis? And some Mefarshim read it as, like I just said, that it's really this was just one letter, and Hashainis is, some people even want to delete it. I think some researchers want to say that it's a mistake, but it's a word that's somewhere hard. Even if we do it, why do we have to say Hazois Hashainis? Okay, Hazois, this one, the second one. If it's obvious that it's the second one, then we don't need the word Hashainis. This word Hashainis is somewhat weird or hard to explain. And the drasha of Reb Shimon ben Levi, or in the Gemara Belazar, said, from this pasuk we learn, Shem Kara is Seba'adarish, when it's Abra Shana, Koine is Seba'adar Shani. So they make a remez from Hashainis to Adar Shani. Now this is a very sort of a far-fetched remez. I don't know if there's a way to make sense of it, to make some pshat why Hashainis would mean it's Adar Shani. I could make some shtiklach teira, pshatlach, but I don't know, pshat, I don't know what's going on. It's a drash. But then, now this is also in the Bavli in a different way. But the same Gemara is in the Bavli also. But I'm not sure if it's not in the same order. Just checking, right? Actually, it is. The same Gemara is in Bavli, and after this, it seems like, or seems like how I would read it. So once we're discussing this Ageres Purim Azes Hashainis, and there's really this question. It's really a bigger question than just the word Hashainis. Let's say the word Hashainis is remes that you should make it another shiny. Okay, there's also other reasons to make it another shiny, both in Bavli and Yerushalmi. If you look later, you'll see there's other reasons to make other shiny. We don't really need this remes, and of course it's a smachta or something. But what is actually going on? So we have the story of Shmuel ben Yitzchok said this story. And they explained, this is how they explained the two letters of Matcha and Esther. He said, Ma'as Matcha Esther, this is the Yerushalmi. They wrote a letter, and I'm going to understand that the Yerushalmi is saying it's the same thing in the Bavli, B'Shem Shmuel ben Yehuda, I think, but it's the same story. They wrote a letter to Chumam, they said, are you accepting upon yourself to make these 2 days of Purim? Then the Chum were not happy with this. That's how the Gemara basically understands. There's both in the Bavli's version and the Yerushalmi's version, the two letters. And they sent a letter to everyone, and the Chachamim, which they obviously must have sent a letter to also because they're the ones that however the Bezdin Shabbos Adar is, has to really agree. It's actually not the pshat of the Megillah. The pshat of the Megillah is that they sent it to everyone, and they were the Chachamim, if anything, or just the people accepted it. But of course, for Chazal, no such a thing the people accept. At least that's not how they understand it. They understand that it was sent to the Chachamim, and whether this is meant to be an historical pshat or it's means that Chachamim nowadays are thinking, should we accept this? Maybe that's another way. That's a way in which we could read such things. And the Chachamim have an answer. They say, this is the language of the Yerushalmi. Now, what does this mean? At least in the Bavli, it's obviously what it says, and it seems like we should have interpreted the Yerushalmi also. The language is not as clear. So maybe some people will say it means something else, but the Bavli says, in other words, we have our own goyim to deal with. We have our own problems. We want to add us a story with Haman, and then all the goyim will say that we're murderers. We killed Haman and his 10 children. It's not a good thing for Yidden and Gules to make a big deal out of their victories. It's rather we should keep things quiet and shine. That's what the Bavli says. And the language of the Yerushalmi is, we have enough tzuras, you're adding us tzuras. What does it mean you're adding us tzuras? Well, not really adding tzuras. You're adding Yom Tov HaNe'Yeshiva tzuras. So it must be understood in a similar way. Or maybe they might be saying something similar that the Gemara said by the Shimon Gamliel said about Megillas Tanis. That we can't keep track of so many tzuras. We have our own problems and our own little redemptions, our own little yeshias. We can't. There's a nice story of Haman. It doesn't seem to be something that they want to. Basically, they think that it's not a good strategy for Yidden and Gules to continue perpetuating the story of Purim. And they might have had a point, if anyone knows Jewish history. You know that the story of Purim and sometimes the Menhagim of Purim were a flashpoint for anti-Semitism in many different periods. So it's not like when you see a shtickle Gemara saying a question, it's not just a story. There's some real problem here, and it might have existed in the times of the Gemara still, and definitely existed even later in different periods. So now, anyway, so this is how they're reading. So there, of course, this all doesn't say in the Megillah, but this is a classic way of Chazal of reading things, and it's also pshat. You could understand if whatever there's something there's 2 letters or 2 statements, so we understand that there was something wrong with the first one. Tichta even says a kol toikev. She added a whole toikev. She added something, and doesn't say what she added, but maybe for this reason itself. But this is something Even Ezra famously said: if the Megillah says that we're assuming that the goyim could read it or they could understand it, so we're not going to write this into the Megillah. But since you see that there's 2 letters, you'd understand that there's something going on, and the Gemara understands that this second letter really continues until the end, where it says, and this is the language of the Yerushalmi, which says that Esther wrote that's another pshat on the Hashainis, really, right? Chazir v'kosfel in Ageres Shniya, as it says, Ageres Hapira Mazois Hashainis, and Maya Kosef Ben. So it's like Mali Ba'arkois is a language in the Gemara. It's already written down in the Goyish records. Arkois really means archives, records, right? Or the court which is creating the records. So in other words, she's saying this battle you lost. If you want to protect us by keeping the story quiet, it's not gonna work because we lost this battle already. All the Goyim know about it, so you might as well make a Yom Tiv and get some happiness out of it. Or I don't know, at least it said answer to this question. It doesn't actually give a positive reason, but I'm assuming that the Chum agree that there's a reason to make a Yom Tov. They're just afraid of the Goyim. They said, it's too bad, we're not going to win the Goyim anyways. So that's the understanding of also slightly midrash reading, because the whole part of Halem Ksiv Al Sefer Divrei Yamim is not the pashtus part of the letter that Esther wrote. It's part of the Megillas Esther, which is not the same as the letter that the Megillas Esther is telling about. But at least from the smichas, from the way that the next piece of the Megillah is this, they sort of read it this way. So that seems to be another pshat. So just to understand the connection, first we had a shyness, meaning that we have to make ba'adar shiny. That's a drash. And now it's closer to pshat, saying that a shyness is the second letter that Esther wrote to create a Purim because the Chum were afraid. So in other words, we got from the story of which other Purim should be to the question, and it's a greater question now, as we'll see in a minute. Now, right now, the Yerushalmi continues, and the Bible continues to explain that this was actually, there's more problems with this question, really. So there's various different problems with making Purim. One problem is the Goyim. Okay, we took care of this problem, but now if you think about it, see, there's an internal Jewish problem. Not only a problem from the Goyim will be mad that we're celebrating our victory over them, or our Haman, which somehow a Goy. The Chacham have their own internal reasons why not to say this. And this is the language of the Yerushalmi, and it's also in the Bible. I'm just reading the Yerushalmi because the Yerushalmi is the one that gets us to this famous statement, but it's all continuing this story. But it's in the Bavli also in a similar way, right? So I said like this is the language of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is actually slightly clearer. The Yerushalmi says, Rav Shmuel Rachanim Shem Rabbeinu said like this: there were 85 Zakainim. From them, there were 30 Nevi'im that were mitzvah. They were very worried, or very, I don't know what mitzvah exactly means when it says something like this. It means they were unhappy. They were working hard to figure out what the halacha is, what's the correct thing to do. This wasn't simple for them. This wasn't easy for them. And I'm assuming that Shmuel, this language of 85 Zakainim and 30 Nevi'im is basically referring to Anshe Knesset Agdola. Very famously, the other language of Anshe Knesset Agdola is Me'ev Esrim Zakainim Mehem Kama Nevi'im. So I'm assuming that 85 plus 30 and turns out to be 115. So that sort of gets us close to the number of 120, which we have in other sources. But this is also the language of the Gemara. So obviously he's talking about the Chacham of this period, which are the way the Chacham understand at least Anshe Knesset Agdola, which even have some Nevi'im. So Chag is Chari Malach, and maybe some other unknown Nevi'im. There's no Nevi'im in Megillas Esther, by the way. Very, very clearly, people talk about why there's no Shem Hashem. There's also no prophecy. There's versions of in the Targum HaShivim version of Megillas Esther that has dreams of Matcha, which is even the Pshat Megillas Esther has Achashverosh having some Noded Ashnas HaMelech, but there's no revelation. So this is Megillas Esther generally works in a world where there's no Nevi'ah anymore. But the Anshe Knesset Agdola have some Shira Nevi'im, Mem Kama Nevi'im. Or in other words, even if it would be Nevi'ah, of course there's a question, because Esther Brecha Kodesh Nemre, this gets us into a very tricky question. But we'll get to this in a second. But anyways, this member is saying they were very worried. Why? Because it says, Ela mitzvahs hashiv Hashem es Moshe, and very famous Medrash Chazal said, Ela ha-mitzvahs. This actually says like 5 times this pasuk, so it's not clear which one exactly they're referring to, but a few of them. And they have a reading. It's a medrash. It's not a pshat. Pshat ela mitzvahs. Just these are the mitzvahs. This is the end of a certain list, because it says a few times in that Torah. So obviously we have to understand the pshat as being the end of a certain list. But the medrash read it as saying ela mitzvahs shensta. V'anikachol amal Moshe en novi acha usid lechadash lechem dovah me'ata. So ela mitzvahs means only Moshe. These are the mitzvahs that Moshe gave, and somehow the medrash reads this to mean these are the mitzvahs. And Moshe is the only one that gave mitzvahs. Any other Navi, even though it says Navi and so on, they are not going to add new mitzvahs. So this is the earliest source for the Rambam's idea of the Torah Moshe being fixed and being the final amount of mitzvahs, which nobody can add to, even a Navi. It's not clear that this is meaning. And again, we're used to reading it in the Rambam's framing. Here it seems maybe it's similar to it, but at least seems to be a problem for these Chachamim, these Nevi'im, which said even a Navi cannot add a mitzvah, Kolshkin, if there's not a Navi, apparently. So how can we add? The Malach Vesta want to add a mitzvah. So that's very, very big problem. Now this is the language of, what's the solution to this? So this is a real problem. In other words, we have a real problem. The first problem of the Goyim, okay, we solved that problem. That's a small problem. But there's a real problem, which is that we are not allowed to, we do not have a right to add new mitzvahs. And the Malach Vesta want to add a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah that they want to add? The language of the Chacham is always Mikra Megillah. Of course, Mikra Megillah doesn't say in the Megillah, and the Pashtas what it does say is Yemei Purim. But maybe Rikon Megillah is just a general Shema Koil. That means everything that says in the Megillah. I'm not sure why they call it this way. But anyways, Matchav has to want to add something, whether they want to add a holiday, they want to add a Megillah, as we'll see in the Gemara. The way this is framed is there's two different questions in the Bavli, and we're gonna have to keep track of this, because in the Bavli, if you read the same story, it's said as two different questions. So the earlier question, just like we had earlier, there's a question about the Kinas Emes, and then there's a question, internal question. And the way it's framed in the Bavli, at least this is Diyak that many Mefarshim Medayik, says first she said Kavuni Ledairis. Kavuni Ledairis means give me a Yom Tiv Ledairis. Then the second one, which we're talking about now, is they have the same story, Shalch Lemet Lachomim. And the Yerushalmi that the Chum are just being down Ben El Vematzmam. But it says Kasvuni Ledairis. Rashi explains, write me down, in other words, write the Megillas Esther. So if you think about it, there's two problems here. One is creating, which we discussed last time, one is creating a Yom Tiv Ledairis, and one is creating a Sefer in the Torah. In the Yerushalmi, it doesn't seem to be talking about writing into a new Sefer into the Tanakh. They're talking about creating a new mitzvah. So these are a slightly different version of the same, maybe the same issue. Maybe it's the same thing. Now we have to really think about if it is this the same thing, because what does it mean to write? What does it actually mean to write? What does it actually mean to write? Add something to the Torah? Where are we adding it? What is the relevance of this? Okay, anyone could write whatever they want. If it's inspired, then people will read it and get inspiration out of it. If not. What is the point? What kind of difference does it make if it's nicht of the doiris? Obviously, there's a difference. And the difference is mitzvahs. Because anything that's nicht of the doiris. Now, of course, we have to ask about all the other kisvei HaKodesh, the other nevim aksivim. But the obvious answer to that is that the other Nevi'im Aksivim, at least in the way the Chacham understand it, of course, when there's some issues, then they have a real issue with that and they have to interpret it. But the way the Chacham understand it, there is no mitzvah in any of the Kisvei HaKodesh. Not even one in the entire, all books of Tanakh, all 19 books, besides the 5 Chavish Torah, all other 19 books, not even one time that says, do this, at least not do it l'dairis. Of course, Nevi'im that said, go to war, don't go to war, and so on. But someone that would say, do this forever, there's not even one, and it's more or less true. I mean, besides for reading Sefer Yechezkel, a few different psukim that make issues for this, but even those, at least in the way the Gemara reads it, the readers are repeating something it says in the Chumash. Now, if it says something different, then we have a kasha. We have to for the stated that the Chumash says like this and the Cheskel says like that. But at least it doesn't say that the Gemara doesn't understand they're saying a new mitzvah. But Megillah Esther, it's at least very hard, and we'll see that they do. But it's very hard to read as just saying again what it's saying over what it said in Torah Moshe, because they didn't say in Torah Moshe. Megillah Esther, obviously. So not so obviously, but I'll be pshat. Now, so therefore, writing something like this and being a new mitzvah of Ela mitzvahs, I think is close to being the same thing. I have to think about this, but it's close to being the same question. But we can discuss this. So, anyways, and this is the language of the Yerushalmi. Now, you have to remember in the Bavli this is presented as a machloikis if Esther has kedushes kisvei kodesh, and it seems the Bavli presents it as a machloikis tanuim. Right? The Yerushalmi doesn't assume that it's a machloikis tanuim. The Yerushalmi assumes that everyone agrees that it's a faket. This is the story that happened in those times. Maybe there were some chachamim that would start before they chachamim unanimously decided to include this as a mitzvah, because they're not thinking about the question of kisvei kodesh. But as far as I can tell, and we'll see in a minute, as far as I can tell, I think it's the same thing. I think that it's the same thing. Yeah, I do think it's the same thing. For the Yerushalmi doesn't have this chilek. It doesn't seem to think that there's one din of ksiva and one din of asiyah. Like the Bavli explicitly makes this chilek later by the Shittas Shmuel and others, but the Yerushalmi doesn't have this chilek. So I think that it's the same thing for the Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi also doesn't have a machloikas here, because it doesn't make sense to have a machloikas. Obviously, there's Purim, right? Obviously, we're doing Purim, so you can't say it's machloikas if we do Purim. There might be a machloikas if the Megillah that we have, if it's a din kisvei kodesh, it's just like a mitzvah of Purim, like Shmuel says, and so on. But we can't really think that it's not, doesn't exist. So for the Yerushalmi, it has to be. Everyone agrees to this. So the Tzarmi says like this: They were discussing this back and forth, but till what does Hakadosh Baruch Hu might mean something close to Nevi'ah, but really it doesn't mean Nevi'ah. It means they found a Mekar. They found in the Torah and the Nevi'im Aksiva, which is not really not sure why Nevi'im Aksiva is relevant here. It's actually weird. We'll see. Anyways, they found in the Torah that there's a source for making this mitzvah. So the pasuk is like this. This, I'm not sure what it means, ksivim b'Torah v'yem ksivim, but this is the way the Bali understands it, right? It says v'yem Hashem al Moshe, right? This is by the Parshas B'Shalach, after the Melchemes Amalek, ksiv zoy zekurim b'Sefer. So the Medrash Darshans, the Chum founder of this book, it says zois means ksiv zois. They say zois means right in the Torah. With the time of zois the Torah, Hashem Moshe lefnei. So zois means the Chemesh. Zekurim ele ksivim, v'kusav b'Sefer zekurim lefanav. Besefer aleksivim, like it says in Mamar Esther Kiyam Devra Purim Elev Nichtav Besefer. So again, the way the Bavli presents this medrash, it's talking about the question of should be right. This is the story of Esther part of Kisvei HaKodesh, and the way I'm understanding is that the same thing of saying do we make a new mitzvah? And now we found that it's not a new mitzvah. Basically, the Yerushalmi understands it's not a new mitzvah. So the Bavli is slightly different because the Bavli seems to agree that it's a new ksav, and we found a makar in the Torah that we're going to add a new ksav. It's like a neviah. And it will be written in Megillas Esther also another Mechias Amalek. Of course, how is Purim Mechias Amalek? That's another question, but Chazal always assume that it is. And the Yerushalmi has to make it a Mekar for a mitzvah, right? Like there's a mitzvah to read the Megillah or to create Purim, and it's not a mitzvah Medevrich Kabbalah, it's a mitzvah Mederais, because otherwise it's Oivran Ella mitzvahs, right? So the Yerushalmi would say that in the Torah, where it's just like any other medrash, so this is not worse than any other drasha that we do, that we dash in something that we might have said as the Rabbana, we might have said as later. We say that it says in the Torah. Why is it different than any other medrash? There's a medrash that says K'soif Zois Torah Zekurim Benevim. Rashi says Benevim means the Neviim that discuss Melchemes Amalek Avshol. I'm not sure if that's what we're meant to mean here, but that's what we understand it. B'Sefer is in Ksivim. In other words, there's going to be a Megillah Esther and Ksivim, and that's our Megillah that we read. That's B'Sefer, V'nichtav B'Sefer, right? That's the second letter also. The second Geras HaPurim Hazeh Shainis. Afterward, it says V'nichtav B'Sefer. So we have a Makar Hayrak Shbaruch Hasanaim that it's not a Hisofa. We're not allowed to add to the Torah, but this is not a Hisofa to the Torah. It says in the Torah already. And this is the Mahalach that the Yerushalmi seems to take in the Hemshech also. So you could say that maybe that's Machloik, because it's slightly different. But the Yerushalmi then, right, the next piece, the Yerushalmi says Rav, Reb Chanina, Reb Yonasan, Bar Kappur, Reb Shimon Levi, Amri, right? So these are the Meroim said, HaMegillah Azois, Nemra L'Moshe Messinai, Ela She'en Miktam Mecha B'Torah. So this Megillah is L'ch L'Moshe Messinai. It doesn't, it didn't happen because Man Moshe Messinai. They said En Miktam Mecha B'Torah. It wasn't mean En Miktam Mecha B'Torah here. Generally, En Miktam Mecha B'Torah is a cloud that sometimes, you could have the Chodesh HaShani before the Chodesh HaRishon, so it's not written in order. So I think they understand it in a similar way. That Moshe Rabbeinu b'Hasina gave the Megillah Esther. It didn't happen yet. The Torah doesn't have to be given in the order that things are happened. It was given before it happened. But basically, and this we can discuss in many ways. It's hard to understand what it means literally. Most basically, the way that I understand this, and this is important for everything here. Heschel calls this Hashita Marchiva in his book Tehrim Nashmaim. There's different statements that go in different ways, but there's one stream in Chazal which say this about Torah Shebal Peh, which is that Torah Shebal Peh is really all included in Torah Shebal Peh. In other words, since we can dash and we can find a drusha and Torah Shebal Peh for everything that will ever happen, so it's as if it's there. What's the difference if it's a drusha, and what's the difference if it happened later? Right? You have to take really, this is what Emek Nemech B'Torah I think means here. You have to take the aspect of time out of the equation, because if time would be the problem, in other words, if we'd be thinking historically, chronologically, then also any other medrash halacha is not in the Torah, right? There's no real difference. Let's try it like this. There's no real difference in a story that happened later and the halacha that was nischadish later. If later come the dash from the Torah, the halacha is kach v'kach, some we say it's in the Torah. Why? Because it's legitimately there, right? At least the way I understand it, the potential for reading it this way was there from the first day. The fact that it wasn't read, that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. So the fact that the first person to read this in this way was Rebbe Akiva, that was in Chadash Dvarim Shlishmas Oizen Ma'olam, that nobody have heard, that doesn't mean that it's not there. It was there. And the potential, the power of finding that there was there. And Rebbe Akiva found it. We could say he revealed it, Mekoich Lapel, different languages, but it was there. And for the same exact thing, we could say about Megillah Esther. If the Torah, like we just saw, if the Torah is Maram is already in the first Melchemes Amalek, that will be something that we associate with Melchemes Amalek later, Bizman Ksivim, or it would be written in a book. Maybe written in a book just means written like one professor wrote in a book. So it's there in the Torah. The fact that it didn't happen yet is just like the fact that Rebbe Akiva still didn't dash in those drushes that he dashed. Okay, so he didn't, but it's still there, and it was just revealed when in its time. That's really what they're saying, I think, that Megillah Zos Nemra L'Moshe Messina. Ela Shemiktam Mechbatar, it wasn't, it's Halach L'Moshe Messina. Just like any other Halach L'Moshe Messina, it's not any other drusha, and we even have a drusha for it. Now, Adkan, the Yerushalmi's first answer to the problem. So in general, in other words, we could say that the context of the Sugya is really the context of the Megillah. Megillah says the Perek, which is how did we get the power? How did Esther and Mordechai have the guts? How did they have the power to create a new Yom Tiv? Nobody created a new Yom Tiv, by the way. And it's very interesting, because there were opportunities probably to create a new Yom Tiv, and nobody did. From the times of Moshe, literally, we have a list of Yom Tov and Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, from the times of Moshe to the times of Mordechai, and there's a whole Tanakh, and we know a lot of history about it, know a lot of stories. Nobody made a new Yom Tov. They were the first ones. And the Gemara talks about this. But there's something interesting here. But this was Mederaisa. Purim is Mederaisa. Just like anything else can be Mederaisa. Now, then after this, and this is our context. Now, after this comes the Yerushalmi and brings a machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Hanavim v'aksiv masidim leibatal, v'chamesh sefer Torah ein masidim leibatal. Ma'atama kol guldav leyasaf." Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is, I'm reading it because I'm just coming from here, so I must have connection with what we're talking about, right? We're talking about how only the Torah, only Moshe Rabbeinu can make new mitzvahs, which is another way of saying only Moshe Rabbeinu can make Kisvei HaKodesh. Just like I just said, it's really the same thing for the Yerushalmi. So what's the story with Nevi'im and Ksivim? So we understand. It seems that Peret Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that's why I'm reading it here. Maybe it's not mamish the pshat, that Nevi'im and Ksivim are not forever. Nevi'im and Ksivim are not Mechai forever. If the Navi says like this, it's a story. It happened l'shatay. There was a need for it. All Nevi'im and Ksivim, and this is also how the Rambam understands Nevi'im and Ksivim. They're all l'shatam haras shokele. Maybe it's just musar, but if there's a mitzvah, it's a sidin lebatal. Chamishev Torah cannot, and he brings up a kol gudav leyasaf. It says by Matan Torah, but he understands it to be all the Nevi'as Moshe, all the Chamishev Torah leyasaf. These are things that I will not. I know my sidin lebatal. Now, what does sidin lebatal exactly means? I don't know at the moment. We don't know yet. But that's sidin lebatal. Now it seems like Rabbi Yochanan, from now the Shlokish comes and says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Af Megillas Esther v'halochas en sidin lebatal. Nema kan kol gudav leyasaf. Nema l'halam v'zichram leyasaf mizarim. Halochas is a posik alichas emle. So it seems like there's a machlokes, right? Where everyone knows it says, right? It says Megillas Esther en sidin lebatal. Let's not. It's machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish. Generally, halochas should be like Rabbi Yochanan. By the way, that it is batal. The Rambam, of course, quotes the Shlokish shita, but not clear why, not so simple. But some people talk about this why. Of course, it's not really a klal. Rabbi Yochanan just most of it, and I go that there's no such klalim anyway. So there might be a reason why he thought like that. But in any way, case it's a machlok. So like I said earlier, everything that we know, if you actually look it up, you see that's not as simple. It's literally a machlokes. At least that the Yerushalmi presents it as machlokes. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, only Chamish Torah will stay. Kol Gadol Yosef. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish adds two things. He adds Megillas Esther v'halachos. So again, very important. He doesn't add only Megillas Esther, right? He adds also halachas. Now it seems to me. Now you can disagree with me. It seems to me, from coming from this context, when you read from the beginning of the Yerushalmi to here, it seems to me that this is a repeat of the earlier discussion. We just said that there's a discussion. Right? What was our discussion? Do we understand Megillas Esther to be part of the Torah, and therefore it's halacha l'Moshe Messina really, and Lektamech Torah, or this was the Havim really of the Chum in the times of Esther? Maybe it's a Devach Chodesh. Maybe we should not take it seriously. Now, I would say that Rabbi Yochanan has another solution to this problem. He says Megillas Esther is not forever. Just like anything else, Nevi'im is not forever. Of course, everyone agrees that a Novi can say a mitzvah l'Rasha. This is also a language of Gemara and so on. Novi could create things, but what can a Novi not do? A Novi cannot make a mitzvah, right? What does a mitzvah mean? A mitzvah means something that's forever. That's Einem Hasidin Libutel doesn't necessarily mean there will be some period that was already butel, basically. Everything, if Yeshua ben said, Duka, make a chayrim and yericha, it's not till this day the chayrim, it's in Bezshat, it was a chayrim, and now it's done. It's a story, it's history, right? All of them are basically history, right? So Rabbi Yochanan seems to, and Rabbi Yochanan includes Megillas Esther. According to Rabbi Yochanan, Megillas Esther is also bottle. In other words, now the fact that we still do Purim, okay, so this is a longer Hadash, so it's going on for some time. Zichron Yosef Mizarim will say, right? For as long as that's continued to be done. Okay, for as long as it's continued to be done, it continues to be done. But it's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. This is the opposite. This would be putting Rabbi Yochanan, and we'll see later that there's good reasons to think that Rabbi Yochanan actually has this shit, I think. At least I have a particular good reason to think this. Rabbi Yochanan thinks, and maybe thinks that it's even about mitzvahs in the Torah, at least in the way they were interpreted by Chachamim, that nothing is forever. And he seems to be the same thing with halachas, right? Halachas just means halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? Halacha l'mayish Messina or halacha. Or even maybe even halachas that have drushes. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying that no, there is what it says in the Torah. So he's in the Shittam Tzimtzet, according to Heschel's categorization. Rabbi Yochanan says, what's in the Torah is in the Torah. That's forever. Ela mitzvahs. Everyone agrees with Ela mitzvahs. What's in the Nevim Aksivim, or what's in the Chumim, there's really no difference, right? We have to remember, for as far as halacha is concerned, as far as mitzvahs are concerned, there's no difference between a Novi and me. Right? Just like I can't make a mitzvah, a Novi can't make a mitzvah. Just like I can make a mitzvah, let us show, a Novi can also. There's actually no, and if you look in the Rambam, it's very clear. People, I don't know why people keep on thinking that it's differently, but it's very clear, and also in the Rambam, but I think also in Gemara, that the din of Eros show is not only for a Novi, it's for Chacham. So everyone could make Eros show, everyone could make Koyach B'Yadechem Lakedev Min HaTorah, and so on. But they do not have a koyach to change the Torah. That's the difference. So you say, meanwhile, there's reasons we're going to, as far as we're concerned, we're going to do things this way, but we're not changing the Torah. Just saying that this is what we should do for now. So I'm not getting into the difference in a Chacham and a Novi here. There's just different reasons why each one can say it. If it's a Novi, then he's starting to say it. It's Shalev Nevi'as Sheker, because God didn't literally say this. God said what it says in the Moshe. You're just saying that we have to change things for a little bit. If it's a Chacham, you don't really have this problem because the Chacham doesn't speak in the name of God. So it's different questions, only questions of that we can't have the Torah change and things like that. So it's really different questions. But I'll call Purim. There's no difference in a Novi and a Chacham like changing the Torah. So the question of Megillas Esther, although Megillas Esther might be a Berich HaKodesh, or all Nevim Aksivim are definitely Berich HaKodesh, Benefia, they're all Bottle. They're all Nasidin LeBottle. In other words, none of them have a Toikef Nitzchi. Just like the only Torah Moshe is real, only Torah Moshe is Mipia Gvira Kepshita. It's can't be changed, or at least not for every way, right? It can be changed Halach Lamasa, but it can't be changed forever. But Nevim Aksivim and Halachas, according to Rebbe Yochanan, are all going to be Bottle. Okay, now Rabbi Yochanan actually, and I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Rabbi Yochanan and Sechtes Nida also says that the Torah mitzvahs Beteilim listed Lowy. Rabbi Yochanan says, right? Rabbi Yochanan Hamoadim, Rabbi Yochanan Ma'adich Siv Ha'mesim Chafshi, Kivin Shames Adam Nas Chafshi Min HaMitzvah. So of course, this listed Lowy is referring to Lo'olam Haba with Ches HaMesim, because he's talking about Kivin Shames. But Al Kapunim, the Gemara has their Machlok, is very famous Machlok, of mitzvah listed Lowy, and Rabbi Yochanan is definitely on the side of mitzvah listed Lowy, Mesim Chafshi. So it seems like Rabbi Yochanan understands, although maybe Ches HaMesim will be the very similar world or this world again, there is no Torah. Now, of course, people ask the questions that Rabbi Yochanan himself, or there might be Gemara, some psikim that talk about Ketzmal Bishon Listed Lowy, different things, and the answer is simple, according to me. When we say mitzvahs tes Listed Lowy, we mean mitzvahs that were interpreted by Chachamim in certain ways. Of course, the truth, as Moshe Rabbani said it, can't be changed. But everything else, which is like B'di Beged and Nevim Aksivim, or halachas. Halachas is really everything, because all the Torah is halachas. These are going to be B'li Batal. And Rav Shimon Loker seems to have the total opposite shit. Rav Shimon Loker says, even af Megillas Esther halachas, enu asid B'li Batal. Why? Nema kan kol good of Yosef. We said just like it says by the Torah Lo Yosef, it says in the Megillah also Lo Yosef Mizarim. So Lo Yosef, right? Lo Yosef Mizarim is making a Gzera Medrash that says that Megillah says also won't be Batal. So he seems to be going in the opposite direction, like we said in a minute before. The Megillah says is really also in the Torah, and if it's also in the Torah, then it also can't be Batal. Same thing for halachas. So he brings a pasuk Kalichas Adam La. In other words, even the halachas are also from Moshe Rabbani, so therefore are not Batal. Therefore, so these are two totally different ways of understanding how we. In other words, what I'm reading from this context is that this is both of these are answers to the question of how Esther could add a new mitzvah. One is saying she didn't add a mitzvah. It's going to be Batul Asad Lowy, so therefore she didn't add a mitzvah. Second one is saying the opposite. She didn't add a mitzvah because was always there. Right? These are two answers. So the question, how could you add a mitzvah? One would say, Rabbi Yochanan says, she didn't. It's not a real mitzvah. It's going to be changed and so on in the future. or has already been changed. Rish Lakish says it's not added because it was always there. Okay, so that's seems to be the. And then we have one more piece from Rish Lakish. I believe Rish Lakish says it's also a medrash brought in the Bavli, but it's brought in this context, and I think it's brought in the sense of another makar for Purim in the Torah. It says, so he said, mitav sheyagdim kaspa shel bunei lekaspa shel oisei rusha, and that's why we read Parshas Shkulim before Purim. This might sort of connect with the discussion of Adarish and Adarshani. I'm not sure how, but in any case, it's definitely connected to the ears. In other words, it's another diet. Shkulim is midayis. So long before Purim, we had Shkulim Adarish Chodesh Adar. So this is Benavia. So that will be Haman. So it's Lagdimi Kasfa Lekaspa. So in other words, this is another Mekar Torah that the Torah was very Tzoifa Benavia that it will be Purim. So this is Kifritus Resh Lakish that Megillah Esther is not put because it's also part of the Torah. Okay, Adkan is how I understand this Mekar of this memory in the Yerushalmi and what the Yerushalmi seems to be talking about. Okay, so now that we've discussed what it seems the context is in the Yerushalmi, and that it is the question of who gave Mordechai and Esther the power to create a new Yom Tov, and the two ways of thinking about this, which are either they actually didn't create a new Yom Tov because it's not a new creation, it's just a temporary thing, like everything from Nevi'im and Ksuvim and Chachamim, or it's not a new Yom Tov because it was forever and it's part of the Torah and therefore will remain, just like halachas according to Rish Lakish will remain part of the Torah for forever. Now, being on this subject, we can see that there are some other answers in Chazal and the Gemara for this question. And this question actually goes back to another earlier source about Purim and about Hamoadim in general. So we know there's the earliest book of Torah Shebal Peh, the first book to exist more or less between the Mikra and the Mishnah, which is known as Megillas Tanis. And Megillas Tanis is a list of holidays created, post-biblical holidays, right? And again, it's interesting because, like I said, that there's post-biblical holidays mostly of Be'ez Sheni, when different good things happen, that's one thing. But why are there no post-Moshe biblical holidays? That seems to be an important question to think. When you want to make a new Yom Tov, you want to say, okay, there's this Yom HaTzillah kach v'kach. Why didn't Yeshua ben make a Yom Tov? Why didn't David HaMelech make a Yom Tov? Why didn't Shmuel HaNavi make a Yom Tov? These are serious questions, and you have to really answer them if you want to make a new Yom Tov. In any case, there's Megillas Tanis. Megillas Tanis is a list of Yom Tovim, the Loyle, Anis Luhan, and the Loyle Mispad Ben. Now, I do think that there's a biblical source for Megillas Tanis. And that source is the source of Tanaisim, B'Ifun Klali. So interestingly, and we have to think about this in this context, I do not see it in Chazal, I know in the Rambam and later Mefarshim that seem to touch on this question, but maybe the Chazals that talk about Batla Megillas Tanis might be touching on this. Why? Because there's another Moed Midrabanan. So the Konas Drabanan mostly don't say in the Tanakh, even if yes, maybe there's one or two that might be minimas in Tanakh. But there's definitely Tanaisim, the Alatanis, that we generally consider Divrei Kabbalah. And Divrei Kabbalah, why? Because in Sefer Zechariah there was a question posed to Zechariah Navi: should we fast? Now that there's new Beis Hamikdash or new Kibbutz Kodesh in Eretz Yisrael, and there was an answer. And the way this answer is understood in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Ches, in Daf Yud Ches Be'erich, is that it depends. So the Navi sort of doesn't answer the question. The Pshat of Navi is that he says, I don't care. God doesn't care if you fast or you don't. What he cares about is if you do. Emes v'shalom. And from my perspective, and as far as I'm concerned, you could have susim v'simcha. I don't care if you eat. I don't care if you fast. It's all the same to me. What's interesting, you should do chesed and mishpat, it's tzedakah. You should do emes v'shalom. That's what God cares about. That's what all the Nevi'im said. He doesn't care about which day you fast and which day you. That's the pshat hanavi. Now the Gemara and Rashuna still wants to know the ma'aseh halacha. What do we need to fast or not? And the Gemara says that tachikama b'zman sheyesh shalom. So in other words, it's contingent every year what kind of situation you're in. If you're in a situation that's similar to the situation of Gullus, where there's not Shalom, there's not Binei Beis HaMikdash, it's Mon Mashman Degmur, there's Sulim Binei Beis HaMikdash, I'm a understand the general Shalom, it's not clear 100%. In any case, then we're happy, or Sesem V'Simcha. If there's still something to fast on, then we fast. So in other words, there's not really a Mekar in Tanakh, in Sefer Zechariah for fasting and Dalatani. So there's a Mekar but if included to fast. And therefore, and I think the Rambam did this very clearly, and said, Tanaisim are really Mederaisa, there's a mitzvah of fasting and doing tshuva and davening when there's a tzura. B'chala is tzura, says V'roisim. B'chatzoitzra, he brings a pusik, and maybe the Gemara in Tanis is Meram is this psikim and so on. So really, the idea of fasting b'shas tzura is a Mederaisa. Fasting shaloi b'shas tzura, the zeicher tzura, is not a thing at all. Because there's no such a thing. We don't have any commemorative fast. The fast that we fast today on Tisha B'Av is not because it's according to what the Gemara Shana says. It's because we're only obligated to fast now if there's no Beis Hamikdash, or even if there's Beis Hamikdash, because there's still some tzuris, if there's still some melchuma, some tzar, but even Beis Hamikdash maybe. But if theoretically, if there would be no tzar, there would be no fasts either. That's the halacha, the halacha. We cannot forget, and therefore it's not a kash that the Nevi'im and the Gemara says. They were not moist of anything. It says twice in the Gemara, and they were not moist of anything besides from Mikra Megillah. What about Tanais? They're not moist of Tanais. Tanais is Tanais that you fast when there's a tzura. And if there's no tzura, you don't fast. That's actually what it says in the Novi, and it's not even a Chiddush halacha. That's the halacha from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu also made fasts, maybe when there has a tzura, if there would be a tzura, maybe by Melchemes HaMolek. But if there's no tzura, we no fast, and that's push it. Now, that's why I think that Yomim HaSirim B'Hesped V'Talis, that is interesting, and I've heard this from Yid, I forgot his name at the moment, but I think it's an amazing pshat. He said, why is Megillas Tanis? It's really Yomei Simcha. Like, why is the whole framing, days that we don't fast, Asirim B'Hesped V'Tanis? It's just like kind of weird. It's like Yid said, Rish Chodesh is a P'sei Yom Tov? No. So can I make a hesped for my father? No. So my father needs to die, that Rish Chodesh should become a Yom Tov. It's not talking about Rish Chodesh really, but doesn't really make sense. So what he said was, and I think this is true, that this is really the Megillas Tanis trying to be mekayim this pusik of Avim Eli Avchilas Simcha. He's saying, on these days we definitely cannot fast. Why? Because there are days that there was some level of gula in them, some level of redemption, and really most of Ma'adim Megillas Tanis are Ba'as Shani, different nitzchanis of the Cheshmonoim and other things from Yemai Ba'as Shani. Therefore, there Zman Esusim V'Simcha, and that's basically going back to the Novi. And again, even this, we have to understand how can we do it. So, of course, there was actually a very big question about the Megillas Tanis, and the Gemara should connect it to the same question. Same question of if Tanais ma Butl is the question of Butl Megillas Tanis. And the Mandom ad Le Butl Megillas Tanis says, no, though Tanaisim have to do with Binyan Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, now there's no Beis HaMikdash, we fast again, although the Pasuk says you don't fast if there's the Beis HaMikdash. But Megillas Tanis, and not to a Lidnecham Beis HaMikdash. But the halacha that we accept, that other Tanaim say, is that Batla Megillas Tanis. And why Batla Megillas Tanis? Because now they were not happy anymore, because whatever good things happen to them, it's like a Katya V'Da Cheshverish, and we'll see. Like, because there's no Zman Simcha. In other words, what we learn from this shit, at least, maybe the Mandam Le Batla Megillas Tanis, Yesh Layin, but Zechel Le Mandam Batla Megillas Tanis, he understands Megillas Tanis not as new mitzvahs. It's not a thing that there's a new day, new Yom Tovim. There's 3 Yom Tovim in the Torah, 5 Yom Tovim, Mechvais with Rosh Hashanah Mekippur, and now there's new Yom Tovim, Yid Gimel Derech Vayzvus. No, there's Yom Tovim in the Torah, that's mitzvahs. Those are mitzvahs. Eila mitzvahs. Lo puchas v'lo yos. Now, every time there's a Zman Simcha, every time there's a Nes, the mitzvah to thank God, the mitzvah to be happy. Avada, you're going to be happy if something good happens. And if you're still enjoying that good that happened, right? You're living in Zman HaMikdash, where you're enjoying the Nitzochen that had and all these days on that Megillas Tanis. So you're going to have K'tzas Simcha in those days. You're not going to have Hesped V'Tanis, because these are days in which there's Simcha. But B'Zman Hazeh, where there's anyways full of tzuras. So it's not shaykh to do a Yom Tov on something that was once. That's shaykh Mederaisa. Mederaisa, there's Yetzias Mitzrayim. This is a mitzvah. Mitzvah is a mitzvah. But these Mederaisa, they're not allowed to make a new mitzvah. What are they? Just tzimcha, that now we're b'simcha. So, okay. So then if you're b'simcha, you're b'simcha. If it's not relevant to simcha anymore, then you can't have Megillas Tanis anymore. Now, what about Megillas Esther? Now, this is a very interesting story. Megillas Esther is in Megillas Tanis, not Megillas Esther. Yom Tov of Purim is in Megillas Tanis, as Yidalit and Tesvav Bech. Other are Purim, the Leilis, honest Leile Mispad B'chain. And the Rav already asked the question, what is this doing in Megillas Tanis? It says in the Pusik already. Now, if we think about it, he has an answer, the literal Zebezeh, Tzadechik Teretz, Alocha, it's a Psan of Kiminal Alocha. If it wouldn't be a Megillas Tanis, it wouldn't be us shall zeh okay, but we still need, it's still not a pshat, it's still stickle drash. Sadiq maybe tallah come in lalach, but we still have to understand what it's doing in Megillas Tanis. And now actually Megillas Tanis has what's known as the skolions, like Talmud on Megillas Tanis. And the Talmud on Megillas Tanis talks about this question, and he says, Rabbi Shimon bar Karcha, Mimois Moshe le'amad Novi v'chidesh mitzvah, chides mitzvah Purim. So until the tens of times of Moshe, no Novi created a mitzvah until Purim. What's going on? But there's one difference. Gilas Mitzrayim is negas shiva, Gilas Malach Vest, and El Gislem Echad. I'm not sure what that answer is. Maybe this is answering that it's not really a mitzvah, it's just one day, so therefore not considered a Yom Tov. I'm not sure what the point of that statement is. Then it says Dover Acher. It's a Kal V'chomer. Gilas Mitzrayim was only on the Schurim, the way the Yom Tov, Gilas Malach in Israel. Al Schurim van la Kaivis Manavad Zokan al Kachas Kavachama Shenichivim Lasses Yom Tov Makol Shana V'Shana. So anyways, these seem to be, I'm not sure about the first statement that he says that it's 1 day and 7 days. Maybe he's also trying to answer the same question by saying that since it's only 1 day, it's not considered a new Yom Tov, maybe. But because Yom Tov is 7 days, so this is just a Yom Hedor, like we just said. But the second thing is going to the opposite, saying that it's a Kal V'chomer. Now, Kal V'chomer is one of the Midas Hadrash. It's Midas. Kal V'chomer is Midas. So he's saying that's Kal V'chomer. If the Torah says that we should make a Yom Tov Pesach every year because all the people, the Yidden were Nitzel, and it was only a Schurim that we're going to die, right? Of course, everyone was Begulis, but Mimuvas L'chaim was only a Schurim. Kal V'chomer is Purim when everyone was Nitzel, even the Nekayvus. And this is very similar. And actually, it's also Rabbi Shimon bar Karcha, and quoted in Pesach Megillah of Yidalid, and another time in the Gemara. I'm not sure where, but it's at least over here in Megillah Yidalid. And he says it's Kal V'chomer. That's actually over there. The Gemara says that it's different. Also, Mem Ches Navim. Nistavli Strovle Pichsule Siral Mashkaza Batoira Ele Mikra Megillah. So my do this. So said Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon Karcha. Mach Kal V'chomer. Mama Abdes Lachayres. I'm Shira. Moves Lachaim Lekolshka. So it's a Kal V'chomer from Pesach. In other words, from Pesach we learn that Pesach is not a din pruti. Not just we have to make Yidalid Benisten Pesach because of the end of time. It's a din clearly. Whenever you go out, Moves Lachim Abdes Lachayres, you have to say Shira. Kal V'chomer. Moves Lachaim. And there, in other words, Purim is a Kal V'chomer from Pesach. It's going like the second way. That this is a limit, it's Midirais. And of course, maybe this is a simpler way of saying it, not have to say that it says in the Torah. We could say there's a din that whenever there's a Yaman Simcha, we have to make a Yom Tov. It's Kal V'chomer fin. Kal V'chomer of Pesach. Now, Kal V'chomer fin Pesach. Now, what do I want to say from this? That the nafkamina from these two ways of thinking is the same question if Purim can be misbattle. So if Purim is just din stam, it's a small Yom Tov, 1 day, it's like Megillas Tanis, then really it should be buttal along with the rest of Megillas Tanis. Now the Yerushalmi says, it's not literally in the Bavli. The Bavli talks about Chanukah, but the Yerushalmi says also about Purim, that after Shabbat Megillas Tanis, the only thing left is Chanukah and Purim. Now why is Purim left out of Megillas Tanis? And that it says, and that's what some Mefarshim say, maybe it's Meferish, that Purim is Mavas L'chaim. In other words, some Yom Tov or some Netzuchen of some Chashmanui or some Yevuni or something, okay, nicht negay anymore. We're in Gulis back. But since we are, Purim is about being saved, being alive, and we're still alive, so we're still enjoying the Netzuchen of Purim, and we're gonna forever enjoy it because if we would have been dead, then everything would stop. So therefore, there's no reason of this the Medirais of a Muvas L'chaim, the Kal V'chomer Muvas L'chaim, even Pesach. Now, if you think about it. Now you get end up even more radical on this. You could say even Pesach could become butl, because Pesach at the end of the day is not about being alive. Maybe for the Schurim, but at least for the Nekayvus, it's about being independent. And even that can be ruined. If we're in Gulas, then it's not clear why we're having Pesach anymore. It's really not clear. I think there's a serious question. Or if there's a new Gila, it's not clear, and there's the Gemara Brachas about this. But in any case, it's less. If Purim is Muvas L'chaim, then life is the most basic thing. So if you're still alive, then it's still Bechlal the Reise, which is a Kal V'chomer. It's like even more basic than Pesach. Even Pesach is only my Avdas L'chayres, but this is a Kal V'chomer. It means that it's even more Chomer than Pesach. It's even more the Reise, and that can be another thing which Rish Lakish is meaning when he says that Megillah says to Mami Butl. In other words, the mitzvah of Purim isn't Butl because it's the same thing. And the reason is because it's a halacha. In other words, like a halacha Mashsin, it's like Kal V'chomer, like any halacha that we learn from Kal V'chomer. In other words, it's Miderais, and he doesn't understand. halachas as something new. He understands halachas as something old. He understands halachas as something which are included already in the original Torah that was given to Moshe Messina. And this is also, I think, that we can connect two members of Rish Lakish and the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. And the Bavli in Pesach Makkos, Rish Lakish says three things the Ben Shalmata did and Ben Shalmal was masking. One of them is Mikra Megillah. And the Yerushalmi, the Rish Lakish is one of the people that said the radical statement that we quoted before that the Megillah is nitna leMoshe Messina. This seems to be not the same thing. Either Ben Shalmata made it and the Ben Shalmal is masking, Kimil Amal Lemash Kimil Mata, or it's Halach Moshe Messina, it's Mikra Megillah. But the teretz on this is actually in the Gemara in Makkos itself. The Gemara says, and actually that's why it's brought in the Gemara in Makkos. The Gemara is talking about someone said, halacha is kol chayv krisis shalukhi nifter midekris. So Rav Yosef asked, the man's halak lai levusav, were you there in Himmel? Anyone was in heaven to tell us that this is the halacha? The Mulei Abaya, Rav Sheba Levi said, how do we know? Mikra nidorish. Kroi kadashina. We dashed from the Pesach that Ben Shalmal was masking. What does this mean? We dashed from the Pesach that Ben Shalmal was masking. How do you answer the question? Either you know or you don't know. Or you dashing a Pesach that's in Ben Shalmata. So I think what he means is what's Ben Shalmal. Ben Shalmal means to say what the Torah originally meant, right? We could have these two discussions: what Moshe Rabbeinu meant, what the Torah meant, and then what the Chumar Mosef, right? So there's one way of understanding that's mitzvah sidelis chadash. It's a new thing. Or makabel chumim have a power to create. But that power is obviously limited because you can't be it's ela mitzvahs. You can't add a mitzvah mamish like Moshe. But if you understand that like Abshim Alev, the Ben Shalmal was masking imam, that's a whole different way of understanding. That's the Shlokish way of understanding, not the Rebbeinu way of understanding. And that way says that we can dash from the Pesach. In other words, we can get into the logic of the Torah. And the logic of the Torah says that there's mavdas lachayres or paralegers schurim, whatever the logic is in both in the schus, both in the Megillas Tanis and both in the Gemara, our Gemara comes out of kol v'chayim. So in a certain sense, Purim is more chamul Pesach, right? And all that's al pi halach. That's mikra nedoir. That's the Ben Shalmal maskim. That's not something that we need to go up to Ben Shalmal to ask. We can understand from what Ben Shalmal did already. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu already brought down the Torah, and his Torah it says Pesach, and Purim is a kol v'chayim from Pesach. So it's in Ben Shalmal. Ben Shalmal is masking Ben Shalmal, and really the Ben Shalmal is getting it from Ben Shalmal. It's not just started here. They're really masking in the sense that it comes from Ben Shalmal, and not it's because the Ben Shalmata was doirish from Ben Shalmal, like Abai said, Kroi Kadashin, and we were dashing the Pesach that Ben Shalmata learned it from Ben Shalmal, and that's the same thing in the Medrash Ris Rabbah. It brought down the whole Nesach closer to the Nesach of the Yerushalmi. Both it's Mishal of both, and you see it says the same Reb Shimon Lai, Reb Chanin, Reb Beis Makpur. They said this language: Hamegillah Azos en nemra mepi bezdin mesina nemra. Elish ein miktam mechabatar. In other words, and this is mamish a continuation of the same statement. Shloisha dvurim God's the ben shalmata veskim him on ben shalmala. In other words, they're saying it's not God's ben shalmata in the sense of they made a new thing, and then the ben shalmala is saying, okay, you know what, you made it, we'll agree. They're saying the ben shalmata, it's really not mepi bezdin, it's mepi Mesinai, because the Ben Shalmata learned it, they learned it out of a svura that's in the rice, and therefore it's with the rice, and therefore this is Yemai Pirim Leinif Tulim to finish off this understanding, which I think is the basic context at least of the Yerushalmi. We'll see that there's other contexts, even in Chazal, but from the Yerushalmi there's the Pshat and the Shittas Reb Shlukish that Mei Pirim, or really talking about Megillah Esther and Valuchas and Neftulim, because he understands Megillah Esther and he understands the Chachamim as getting into the source of the logic, the shoirish logic of the Torah. And if they're getting into the source of the logic of the Torah, then it's in a certain sense even more powerful than what says in the Torah. Because what says in the Torah still needs interpretation, but this is the interpretation itself. This is the svur that the Torah itself is based on, and therefore we know that this is midorais or even tifa than regular derais in a certain sense.